All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to join us for our lecture series. Today, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome Emily Stewart, who's a research analyst at the China Aerospace Studies Institute. And her talk today is titled Chinese Perspectives on UAVs, Unmanned Aerial Vehicles, and manned/unmanned teaming in future conflicts. And today, in this talk, she's going to share the perspectives that she and her co-author, John Chen, have uncovered in their research on the development of China's People Liberation Army, PLA, drone swarm and unmanned teaming technologies and potential future employment strategies. She's going to give a little bit of an overview of sort of their autonomous systems doctrine. They're going to talk about research, development, as well as sort of current and projected capabilities. And this is all based on a paper that she and her co-author have that is forthcoming. And if you look up Emily's name, you can see she's done a lot of research on this topic. And this will be another paper sort of in this field that she has done. But this should be of a high degree of interest to a lot of you here at the lab who work on Chinese military capabilities, who look at sort of emerging technology, and who may be more particularly focused on sort of, artificial intelligence, drones, control, things like that. So let me say a little bit about the speaker before she gets started with her talk. She is an Air Force Reserve Intelligence Officer, serving on active duty orders as a research analyst with the China Aerospace Studies Institute. In her reserve capacity, she is the chief of the Ground Forces Military Capabilities Branch at the Indo-PACOM JIOC, Joint Detachment Denver. She was commissioned through the Air Force Reserve Officer Training Corps at the University of Northern Colorado and holds an MA in International Security from the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, which is an excellent program. She's held multiple positions in intelligence across the United States and Qatar. Prior to her current position, she was the Assistant Director of Operations to the 38th Intelligence Squadron, 655th Intelligence Surveillance and Reconnaissance Wing at Beale Air Force Base here in California. For ground rules, for those of you who don't tune into CGSR lectures, she's going to deliver her remarks for about 30 to 45 minutes, at which point we'll open the floor up for discussion for the rest of the time we have. To make my life easier, to make her life easier, feel free at any point in the conversation to get your hand up electronically or submit your questions into the chat. You can submit them to me directly. You can submit them to all the panelists and I will see them. And that way, as soon as she's done talking, as soon as she's gone through her slides, we can get the discussion rolling and we can get a lot of you into the conversation. So Emily, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Over to you, and Katie will now get your slides up on the screen so everybody can see them. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and thanks to Katie and Raul for getting this set up, and thank you everyone for having me this morning. As Mike said, I'm a researcher with the China Aerospace Studies Institute. If you're interested in our publications, here's a QR code to our website, or if you Google CASI, C-A-S-I, AU for Air University, it's the first link that pops up. So slide. Yep, there we go. Sorry, I didn't know that was an animation. First and foremost, these comments are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Department of Defense or the Department of the Air Force. Slide. So here's what we're going to go over today. Might kind of summarize a little bit of it. First, a plug for my employer. I'll talk a little bit more about what CASI does, and then get into how the Chinese talk about drone swarms and potential uses in a future conflict. And again, feel free to interrupt at any point. I definitely prefer conversation to monologuing, so happy to take questions throughout the briefing.
I said they'll take questions after you're finished with your presentation.
Okay. Also, a small disclaimer, I am not an engineer, so I'm actually really excited to hear from you all that have a little bit more of a technical background, because I work with poli-sci nerds all day long. So this is coming from that perspective. So who is CASI? When I say CASI, people think I'm referring to a person, so that's why I've spelled it out like that. But we stood up in 2017 under a CSAF, Chief of Staff of the Air Force Charter, to study everything that flies in China. Most of our staff speak fluent Mandarin, and the first thing that they were really doing was finding Chinese strategic documents and translating them to English to make them more available for the military as our #1 customer, but also private citizens as well that are trying to learn more about the Chinese threat, and also our partner and allies. We have a really big hard time sharing information with them sometimes. So 95% of what we do is unclassified, so it makes it really, really shareable. We are a small team right now, currently about 10 analysts and some Air Force fellows, but we are hiring. So if you know anyone that speaks Mandarin, point them towards me and I will get them set up with our director. Slide. And these are just some examples of our publication. We have the PLA Aerospace Power Primer, which is a 1,000-mile long, 2 inches deep overview of the PLA Air Force and their other aviation units. And again, we do a lot of translations of strategic documents. And walk it forward a little bit, Katie. One example is the Science of Military Strategy, which I'll get into a lot during this briefing. China is very big on science and numbers and data. They believe that if they have enough data and the right algorithms, no problem is unsolvable. And so you'll see this repeatedly in their works, the science of military strategy, the science of space operations, the science of information operations. And then this is a People's Liberation Army Daily newspaper article. So we read these pretty frequently. And that's kind of like the Air Force Times for the Chinese military. I think there's 1 or 2 more on this. And then this is primarily what I've been looking at is research papers and patents from the Chinese themselves and seeing where they think their strengths and weaknesses are, as opposed to what we assess them to be. Slide. So what initially prompted my research on drone swarms was a team in the UK came across this video on the bottom right of a drone swarm reportedly chasing a target through a bamboo forest. And that could be fairly alarming. And they reached out to us and asked if we had anything available on it. So I just leaped down the dark, deep rabbit hole of that. They also found some patents, so that's where I started initially. Initially looking at this video, it's hard to tell from a poli-sci untrained eye if those drones were actually working collaboratively, or if they were individually controlled, or if they were pre-programmed to operate that way. Unfortunately, we had a team of engineers look at it, and they were, no kidding, collaboratively, relatively autonomously chasing a target through a bamboo forest. And when I talk about swarms, that's what I'm most concerned about. Not necessarily the proto-swarms that we see in the Russia-Ukraine conflict and Israel-Gaza, where it's a lot of drones headed towards an air defense system or a specific target. But when we talk about swarms, we're talking about those that can work together, they can share data, and they can do that with limited human interaction. On the top here, that's an example of a vehicle that they've made they can launch individual drones out of the back of these canisters. The one in the middle bottom was at one of their air shows a few years ago, and those characters spell out wealth. It was one of the first drone light swarms that we'd seen. Turns out, and you probably know this, but the algorithms to do that are not necessarily as sophisticated as they would need to be a truly collaborative system. It's kind of here's where I need to be, and I'm going to stay 5 feet away from my buddy. And that's pretty much the coding. And then we got a little spun up because China released this picture on the bottom left with a bunch of drones on an aircraft carrier, and they were claiming to be the first nation capable of launching a swarm from a carrier. However, those drones pictured are not collaborative. There is just a lot of drones. So when we look at their research, we're trying to parse out what is just a mass of drones and what's truly collaborative. Slide. Also, when we talk about swarming, and this goes into is it just a lot of drones or are they collaborating? I found this graphic by Paul Scher. He's a DC think tanker that does a lot of artificial intelligence research. And this is what I used in my original paper to categorize the sophistication of the patents I was finding. The ones specifically geared at developing new algorithms for collaboration. So what we see the most of currently around the world is that centralized coordination, where it's one operator controlling many drones. There was a recent study done by the University of Oregon that found one person could control up to 130 drones. However, that's in a benign environment. They're not being jammed and they're not being shot at. So I really would love someone to do an updated study on what that looks like in a contested environment. Next, we have hierarchical coordination, and we'll see this a lot when we start talking about the man-unmanned teaming, where you might have one ground station, and then you have maybe 2 to 3 like mother drones, and then or manned aircraft, and then you'll have like slave drones out in the front gathering all the data and reporting it back and reporting it back. Next, you have coordination by consensus, and this and hierarchical communication were what I found the most when I was going through the patents initially. This is where I'm sure there's more than one way to do this, but the one I saw the most of was that each drone is a sensor and they will gather the data and they'll send it all to each other, and all of the drones collaboratively will form kind of a matrix, and they'll decide which drone is best equipped to do what mission, and they'll send that data back out and task those drones to do that. And then last is the emergent coordination, which is that's really when we think of like how bees and birds and fish schools operate. This is emergent collaboration where I don't necessarily need to know what this guy over here is doing. I just need to know what the guys next to me are doing, and we're going to adapt and flow as needed. Slide. And then when we talk about man-unmanned teaming, this can mean a couple different things in general. This is definitely a newer concept for the Chinese. It's much less developed than their swarm research. And it can mean primarily like one manned aircraft controlling 2 or more drones. Typically, they got this idea from our Loyal Wingman program, but we've seen a few different renditions of this, whether it be the manned aircraft in the back in friendly space controlling forward drones, or they actually talked about doing that vice versa, which I'm not quite sure how that would be advantageous because you're still putting the manned asset in harm's way. They also talk about a manned asset controlling a swarm. So the manned asset is the data processing center for that swarm. So the drones themselves don't have to do that data processing, and it frees up bandwidth and payload capacity. We've also seen, I saw one reference to an intelligent backseat operation, which the US is developing as well, where it's kind of like you have AI in the backseat instead of goose. That's how that works. And they've looked at that a little bit, but it's definitely much less extensive than these other models. Slide. So for this paper that John and I did, our prompt was to find out how China talks about this, and then the recent developments that are trying to get after their objectives and swarms and MUMT. So we looked at the Science of Military Strategy, and these documents have gone back a while, back to at least 2013 is when they started talking about autonomous systems. And the Chinese put a lot of emphasis in getting to autonomous systems. They realized, primarily during the Gulf War, how far behind they were vis-a-vis the US, especially in how their systems can talk to each other. They didn't have a joint force until Xi Jinping took over and revamped the PLA in 2015, 2016. And they didn't have that network connectivity connective tissue that we do that allows for joint all domain operations. So when they talk about autonomy, they want to get after these overall objectives of strategic operations, primarily versus the US in a Taiwan scenario, long range, reaching out at least to Second Island Chain, if not further. Second Island Chain is an archipelago that goes from the bottom of Japan through Guam and then down to the South Pacific. Island operations, and primarily in the East and South China Sea. They want high precision, highly networked capabilities because they've seen how well that's worked for us. That integration of cyber, electromagnetic warfare, and space. And then we've also seen them use these capabilities towards their public opinion jurisprudence and psychological operations. So when I'm going through these patents and research, a lot of it's not driven towards Taiwan. Most of it is, but there is also a lot of it aimed at controlling their own population with these capabilities as well. And then in 2015, so right after Xi Jinping reorganized the PLA, they put out a defense white paper that's since been updated, but that really emphasized the strategic early warning, airstrike, air and missile defense, information countermeasures, and we've seen this most recently, if you've seen in the news, they just stood up their information support force that's aimed to really get after that connective tissue of the information domain and the cognitive domain. Strategic progression, again, echoing what we saw in the science of military strategy, and comprehensive support. So they are really emphasizing logistics lines and countering our logistics lines as well. But most importantly, from these documents, especially the science of military strategy, we see them continually emphasize autonomous operations and UAVs, other autonomous systems as well, like sea-based and land-based, but we'll just focus on air today. And what we see from that is that when you say things more than once, it means it's important. So they've been emphasizing this for over 10 years, and they're throwing a lot of money at it. Slide. But at the end of the day, they're still assessing how they want to use this in warfare. So I talked about Paul Schar's models for autonomy. We found a few Chinese researchers that talk about it as well. Human in the loop is where we're currently at. It's one-to-one, a UAV controlled by a human, and the human remains in control of everything. So while they might have some autonomous operations, the human still maintains overall control. Then we see human atop the loop, which this is the majority of where their research seems to be focused and what they're most comfortable with. So the UAVs have most of the autonomy, but the human still controls the kill switch. They control kinetic strike and non-kinetic strike operations, and can void or negate the whole mission if needed as well. And then we see human outside the loop, and this is where the UAVs are completely autonomous and don't require or respond to human commands at all. The Chinese, and I will say there's not a whole consensus in the Chinese expert community about this. My boss actually disagrees with me, so we argue about it a lot. I have not seen anything in the research that we've come across that China will ever fully delegate a kinetic kill command to a UAV. Everything that we've seen so far has said that the human will ultimately be in charge of that. Where we do see full autonomy potentially coming online is more with ISR operations and like known target lists. And it's there's a potential that they could in the distant future develop a system that could go after a predefined target deck and conduct strikes against it, but we haven't seen anything like that so far. Slide. And then here was another model that we saw as well, and this kind of gets into the man-on-man teaming as well. So human operated machine operations, that's what we see currently. Human machine cooperative operations. So that could be MUMT. It can also be a semi-autonomous UAV and a ground controller working together rather than the ground controller doing all the commands for that UAV. And then machine autonomous operations where they are wholly in control. Again, there's a spectrum from the human is completely in control and the machine is completely in control. And of all the research and patents we found, it's definitely within the middle. It's not on one extreme or the other. They are, most of their objectives center around keeping that manned platform safe and extending their reach beyond what they're comfortable sending a manned asset in to do, as well as extending their reach for early warning. Slide. So after we looked at strategic documents, we started looking at specifically at their research and their media. So that PLA Daily I talked about, CCTV, and the Journal of China Military Science. And I kind of talked a lot about this already, but they are looking, especially with swarms, they are looking at multiple mission sets. We'll come to a slide here in a minute of all the different mission sets I found when I was looking at patents. They are trying to move away from centralized control into decentralized operations, potentially against predetermined targets. Mothership operations is something that could work with MUMT or swarms. I talked about earlier how there have been studies and patents designed to have kind of that hierarchical control structure. So we call it hierarchical, they call it mothership. So you might have a ground station and a swarm, or a ground station and a couple UAVs, or a ground station, some larger UAVs, and then a bunch of slave UAVs farther out. And that is super helpful because to get the data processing that they really want to be totally autonomous and to get that data flow in a highly contested dynamic environment, that's a lot of bandwidth. And the little tiny guys don't have the payload currently to be able to process that. And so if they can offload that onto a larger drone or a ground station closer to friendly areas, that frees up payload and allows them to be smaller and more stealthy, less observable, lower radar cross sections. They've also dabbled in edge computing networks to infiltrate an enemy's weapon engagement zone. Again, they've talked about extending the field of regard for an early warning radar. So currently, like our large LPAR radars can see this way, but they can't necessarily see like around the curvature of the earth. So once you get out beyond that field of regard, if you have drones that can extend further and then pipe that information out, that just increases your field of regard. And then urban warfare as well. And this definitely ties into a Taiwan invasion scenario because they will absolutely need to be more proficient in urban warfare, being able to track targets through narrow alleyways and in buildings. we've seen this unfortunately used in their geared towards their own police forces and towards their own population centers as well for urban observation. And we also saw some papers that weren't necessarily defense. They didn't list a defense objective, but they could absolutely have a defense application, like firefighting in a building where you have to seek out where the fire is and then zap it with a fire extinguisher payload. Like, just switch out that payload for a kinetic or a electronic warfare payload, and that's something completely different than a firefighting mission. So, slide. And then we looked at the same thing for man-unmanned teaming. This one, they are still trying to figure out like what the realm of possible is. So they're dabbling in a few different areas, and they haven't really narrowed it down. Whereas with swarms, we see them, they're really just trying to perfect their algorithms at this point and make them better, smaller, faster. So with MUM-T, there's a lot more scenarios out that they're still talking about. We talked about the manned asset operating as the command asset. They've talked about using the unmanned assets to paint a target. So manned aircraft will stay outside the WES and send in the UAVs to find a target, and then the manned asset will engage that target. Or to kick in the door, so the manned aircraft stays where it's safe. A UAV or a handful of UAVs come in and take out like an air defense system, and then that manned asset can get in there more safer and take out targets further into the engagement zone. They've talked about using a manned asset and then unmanned UAVs with different types of missions. So you might have an attack UAV, you might have an EW UAV, or just an ISR UAV that's increasing that battle space awareness for the manned asset. Especially, they talked specifically about locating high value assets like our RC-135s and some more stealthy, less observable assets as well. The one I think is kind of cool, unfortunately for us, they're talking about using it for additional guidance for air-to-air missiles. So on Chinese fighters, especially the older ones that they've trained with a lot more, the manned aircraft needs to maintain line of sight on that missile before it hits its target. So that requires it to stay in a potentially dangerous zone for longer than it might be comfortable with. So if they use a UAV to maintain that line of sight, the manned asset can peel away, and that UAV can maintain that air sight until the air-to-air missile hits its target, or air-to-ground missile as well. And then integrated force packaging, they've talked about some mixed manned, unmanned, lethal networks of all different mission sets. So you might have a fighter and a bomber manned aircraft, and you might have attack, ISR, EW, unmanned aircraft that are all working collaboratively together. And again, none of this has been employed yet. We have seen them have a manned aircraft and a UAV in the airspace at the same time, and they took a picture of them on the ground together, but they weren't actually cooperating or talking to each other at all. They were just there together. Slide. And then this is still where most of their efforts are at right now. Again, with the swarms, they're trying to address specific fixes to the research that they've already done to make those systems more effective. They're looking a lot at task allocation solutions. So what's the best solution of hierarchical or collaboration by consensus? Which UAVs are doing what? Is there a manned asset involved? Is there ground station involved? And what does that look like for the most optimal mission set? We talked about target detection and tracking and a coordinated attack. Again, MUM-T is still largely in the exploratory phase. And they're trying to figure out what technology they need to do it at all. And they're looking to other countries, specifically our Loyal Wingman program, again, to see where what the best practices are so far. Slide. But all of these go into, again, getting after that highly contested dynamic scenario. That's where they want to get at, and all of these point towards that. This is based off the paper that I published last year. Sorry, I have a dog in my lap right now. And I looked at every Chinese patent until March 15, 2023 that had their term for drone swarm in the body of the text. I looked at who was writing those patents, if they were from the People's Liberation Army or the PLA, if they were like a defense contractor or a state-owned enterprise, or if they were not, if it was a truly private company. There were a couple like patents for pizza delivery drones, things like that. So those fell into that category. And then of the ones that were from the PLA or were from defense contractors and SOEs, I looked into what missions those patents were going towards. And most of them were in the C2 and navigation realm. And that makes sense because to do any of this, you need to figure out the C2 piece first. And after that, navigation becomes really important, especially if you're thinking about it in a contested environment where GNSS might not be available. And then beyond that, there actually weren't that many offensive patents out there, but I was only looking at their unclassified patent database. They do have a separate classified patent database, just like we do. So I imagine there are quite a few more offensive mission capabilities in that realm. There are a couple defensive, couple target acquisition and tracking, which I categorize separately than navigation. They did have a few operations under degraded conditions, so they were trying to figure out how. You think of a strand of Christmas lights, the old kind, where if you pulled out one light, the whole thing went down. They were having the same problems with their swarms, where if one goes down, the whole thing goes down. So they're trying to develop like a self-healing swarm, where if one goes down, the other ones still have the data they need to carry on the mission, or maybe that guy can like Hail Mary all of his information to his teammates before he's totally killed. Or if I'm being jammed now, do I fall out of the sky, or can I still maneuver without comms and GNSS until I get back into a safe zone, and then I can pick up my mission again? For similar things, they're looking at encryption to make sure that they maintain control of their assets in degraded and congested environments. And then support operations as well, like different kinds of launchers, different kinds of consoles that can talk to UAVs regardless of who made them originally. Slide. Field tests, again, we haven't seen much of this. We did see some CCTV footage of a couple Army units using swarms in a reconnaissance mission, like a let's go look over this hill type of thing, but it wasn't a true swarm. It was a lot of UAVs controlled by one or two people. And so all branches of the PLA, Army, Navy, Air Force, Rocket Force, and the Central Military Commission as well, they all operate drones. But so far we've only seen the Army operate a swarm or a group of small drones. When I was looking at the patents, all but two of the PLA institutions were aligned with the Army or the PLA writ large, like their version of National Defense University. And there was one from the organization formerly known as the Strategic Support Force, and one from the Air Force Early Warning School as well. again, they briefly mentioned an intelligent backseater to their J-16, but I couldn't find any more information on that. I think we talked about intelligence victory. I think they want something similar. And also loitering munitions, which kind of like you shoot them out from a fighter aircraft typically, or a manned asset, and then they can hover and or attack when needed. That would be separate from like a ground launched UAV swarm. And lots of ADVON ISR field tests with their ground forces. Slide. We've talked about a lot of these already. So balancing operating and computing power with their payload size, balancing the size of the swarm. So ideally you would want as many drones as you could feasibly afford and control. But when you do that and they're all operating on the same frequency, it can get really congested. Or if other drones are operating on the same frequency as well. So how do you get around that? Overcoming the potential for wide mission areas. How do you keep control over a swarm that you can no longer see? And that's where that collaboration or the man-on-man teaming really comes in handy, is that you don't need the ground station to be able to have line of sight or even operate through a satellite. A lot of these research papers and patents are trying to be independent of space as well, because they see how reliant we are on space. And they don't want to be in that ballpark. We talked about the single UAV going out, ruining the whole swarm. That offloading of data from the smaller drones to assets in the rear to do more of that high capacity data analysis. Communication delays as the size and distance of those drones continue to grow. And then making sure that they are encrypted and not as susceptible to jamming or spoofing or other malicious interference conditions. Slide. So to wrap up, again, especially with MUMT, they're focusing on multiple lines of efforts and different technologies to improve what they already have on the swarming capability research. It remains to be seen how they will actually employ this in a Taiwan invasion scenario. They have also talked about using these systems for border defense, like with the line of actual control with India and some of their neighbors to the southeast as well, and their own populations. They are absolutely watching what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and in the Middle East right now to refine their own tactics, and they're watching us to see what we're saying about this. And I haven't seen them reference the Hellscape strategy yet, but I'm sure it's not far behind. And they're trying to figure out the best bang for their buck. And unfortunately for us, China is great at the done is better than perfect strategy. So getting to the 70-80% solution without having the most exquisite platform out there, but it gets the job done and it's not as expensive. So if it gets killed, it's not as big of a deal. And it's reconstitutable. And slide. And then, as you can see behind me, I absolutely love books. So if you are new to the China studies, here are some absolutely wonderful things to add to your bookshelf, especially Active Defense and the Avoidable War. We give those to our Air Force fellows when they come on board. The Prince is all about Xi Jinping and how he rose to power. Tracking People's Daily is a translated version of the People's Daily that gets emailed out every day. And then if you're interested in information warfare and cognitive domain stuff, the Cognitive Crucible podcast is really great as well. But I think that's all I have. So time for questions.